Get ready. You are about to experience the life science effect. The most influential players in biotech, pharma, and medical device, bringing you their insights and inspirational stories. Are you ready to boost your career? Ready to set your medical innovation in motion? You have arrived at the right place. Every week, another industry leader, more insights, more inspiration, and tips you can implement right away to make your mark on the world. Hey everybody, welcome to the show. Steve Vinson here. Unfortunately, my guest for this week had a death in the family, and so it's taking care of that emergency. Obviously, light years more important than anything we're doing here. So our hearts go out to him, and he'll be on at a later date. But this week, I thought I'd take the opportunity just to talk with you one-on-one again and tell you a story about how I got started in medical device, and also focus on medical device a little bit this week in terms of what's coming up in 2019. Interestingly, a couple of weeks ago, when I did a one-on-one with you, we talked about biopharma and what is coming up in 2019 for biopharma. So a lot of the shows lately have been about medical devices. And so I thought, well, let's talk about medical device for a week. So let's just start out with, well, how did I get in medical device? Because if you listen to the episode 0, you know that I spent most of my career in pharmaceuticals. I started out in pharmaceuticals and sort of cut my teeth that way, and then ended up in medical device. Well, I thought before just take a step back before I get into, well, how did I start in medical device? Let's talk about the difference between a pharmaceutical and a medical device, and why we'd even talk about them separately in the first place. Well, pharmaceutical is, by definition, something that makes a pharmacological, biological change in your body in order to cure a disease or treat a disease or manage some sort of condition. Whereas a medical device makes some sort of a physical change or serves to diagnose a disease or a condition or a disorder or something within your body. So in other words, you could kind of think of it in terms of something that makes a biological change, like in your cells or on a cellular level, on a biological level, versus something that doesn't make a biological cellular change to your body. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, and international regulatory bodies draw that distinction because the risks are different. How you make these things are different. There's just a lot of things that are different about them. One of the interesting things is, an astute listener would say, well, what about an insulin pump or a preloaded syringe? Doesn't that do both? Isn't there a device that is actually delivering the drug and there's a drug, the insulin? Well, how do they regulate that? Actually, FDA has a word for that. It's called combination devices. I guess that's 2 words. Okay, well, actually, FDA has 2 words for that. And they call it a combination device. And one of the changes in 2019 is actually how international regulatory bodies are viewing combination devices. In the past, meaning basically now and previously, companies sort of had flexibility to choose which regulations they would abide by, whether it's the pharmaceutical regulations, which is governed by, the insulin piece of that, preloaded syringe, or the medical device regulation, which is the syringe part of the preloaded syringe. And the guidance was pretty much whichever you considered to be the predominant portion of that combination device, that would be the regulation you would follow. So that's combination devices. And in a minute, I'll tell you how that's changing, starting basically now, but you have a little bit of time to get in compliance if you're not already. So with that teaser and that little bit of suspense, keep listening because I'll get into that in a minute. As I said, I started in pharmaceuticals back in the early 90s. By that time, the FDA had written regulations around how you're supposed to make pharmaceuticals, how you're supposed to test them, what you're allowed to say when you're marketing them, and how you're allowed to sell them, among a lot of other things. And the two main regulations for manufacturing pharmaceuticals are encoded in the Code of Federal Regulations called Chapter 21 CFR Parts 210 and 211. And that governed how you could make them. Now, to people in the industry, that means something. Interestingly, it meant nothing to me for the first 5 or 10 years of my career. I didn't know, like people would say 210, 211, and they would sound really smart to me. And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. What I eventually found out was they were talking about specific regulations that the Food and Drug Administration had written. The reason I didn't know anything about those specific regulations was that the companies I worked at had written procedures that talked about how they would meet those regulations. And so all I cared about were the procedures and that I was following those specific procedures. I didn't need to know what the regulations said. Okay, so through the course of my career, I'm working at these pharmaceutical companies. And when I came to Indianapolis in 2005, I decided to branch out and not just work in pharmaceuticals and maybe not even work in a manufacturer. I mean, I have a famous story I'll tell someday about finally deciding I didn't want to work in dirty chemical plants anymore. And for a chemical engineer, that might sound weird, but if you've ever been in a dirty chemical plant, it probably sounds about right. So the way I managed to do that was I learned some things about IT and IT projects. And my second, and so if you manage an IT project, obviously you don't have to be in a dirty chemical plant if you don't want to be. I'm trying to imagine the person that wants to be in a dirty chemical plant going, yeah, but can I manage? Can you put my desk out next to some vat of chemical, maybe like something like the Joker fell in Batman. Anyway, that having been said, I didn't want that part. So IT projects for me. And the second thing I wanted to do at that time, and now we're fast forwarding into the late 90s, early 2000s, a lot of manufacturing was heading overseas to Ireland, to Puerto Rico. And I realized that if I didn't want to have to be traveling all the time, I'd probably have to find a way to be able to work in any city I ended up in. And for me, that was, I figured out it could probably be hospitals. I mean, it's not a huge stretch to go from a regulated manufacturing industry to a regulated healthcare provision industry. So I found a way to get to Indianapolis, managed an IT project in a hospital. That project eventually ended, so I was in need of another project. So I called up my friend from Chicago and said, hey, I'm looking for another project. And he said, hey, I just happen to be doing a project near you in Spencer, Indiana, but it's at a medical device company. And I said, whoa, I don't have any experience in the medical device field. And he said, don't worry about it. We'll teach you whatever you need to know. So I said, great. And this was Boston Scientific, for those who are wondering. What I found out when I got there is, and I didn't know this before. So I talked about these regulations 210, 211. What I found out is in the early 90s when I was working at pharmaceutical plants, the regulations for medical devices hadn't really been fully rolled out yet. And the regulation for medical devices, just throw out another number, is 21 CFR Part 820. And it was quite a bit different from the pharmaceutical regulation. And the way it was different was they took what they had learned from the pharmaceutical industry and they applied it to the medical device industry. And so what they ended up with was something that was a bit more specific about what exactly you're supposed to do. If you saw 210 and 211 for the pharmaceutical industry as sort of here's the results we want you to get, you figure out how to get there. They took the medical device regulation and wrote that with, we're going to kind of tell you how to get there. And they put specific processes you're supposed to follow and specific components of your quality system that you're supposed to have in place. So I learned that. And I also learned that a lot of medical device companies hadn't quite gotten it yet. And the way that the FDA, at that time at least, was approaching things was, we will get people to follow our regulations by going out and writing some very high profile citations against some major manufacturers, and then everybody else will get the idea. So I would call that growing pains. And as you might have heard, if you listened to one of the previous episodes and you stuck around long enough, you would have found it was also a very lucrative business for several large companies, large consulting companies, to go out and try to help these medical device companies get out of trouble with the FDA. I'm happy to report that Boston Scientific got out of trouble with FDA because they demonstrated they really got it. They understood what the government was looking for, and they implemented the changes, and they're doing fine. So that's the reason I mentioned their name. Normally, I wouldn't mention a client's name, especially if they're still kind of in trouble. Boston Scientific did what they needed to do, got things fixed, and they're doing great now. Okay, so then well, for me, after that project, I went to another medical device company and did similar work because it was another one that was a little slow on the uptake, going through growing pains. So we got them through the issues. And then after that, that was traveling, actually. That was over in Ohio. I didn't like traveling, so I came back home and did a project that was neither pharmaceutical nor medical device. It was actually a clinical trial laboratory. And clinical trial laboratories was diagnostic laboratory, as it turns out, don't have to follow any of those regulations. They have a completely set of regulations outside of the FDA that they follow, but they're very similar to the FDA regulations. That project was supposed to be a 6-month project. 6 months and 6 years later, I finally completed that series of projects and went back into pharmaceuticals. And what I found out after going back to pharmaceuticals was the pharmaceutical industry, or at least the portion of the FDA that governed the pharmaceutical industry, took some lessons from the medical device industry. Things were suddenly way more specific, way more what we call prescriptive about what it is you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it. So I found it interesting. So I start my career in pharmaceuticals, and the FDA kind of left it up to you to figure out how to follow the regulations. I get over to medical device. I find the FDA decided, well, we're not going to allow you to kind of figure it out. We're going to tell you specifically what you're supposed to do. And then I go back to pharmaceuticals and find out the FDA had sort of changed course there, and we're getting really specific about what you're supposed to do. Since life is a circle and what goes around comes around, now I can finally tell you the outlook for 2019 and beyond for medical devices. So what we're seeing now is that a quality product is becoming, well, let me rephrase that. What I was going to say is a quality product is becoming more the focus than specifically following the regulations. I don't think the FDA ever meant for it to be any different than that, but they're humans just like the rest of us, and they're a big organization just like a lot of companies, and they're sort of figuring this stuff out too. So what the FDA is trying to push now is more focus on quality than on check the box compliance with the regulations, and they know that they're somewhat culpable in all this too. The way they've enforced the regulations has kind of pushed companies toward, well, let's check the box and make sure we're in compliance, with not enough focus on let's make sure we're making a safe, effective medical device. Well, the great thing is, through initiatives like the FDA's Case for Quality, and if you just Google FDA Case for Quality, it'll lead you to the FDA's website that tells you what that is, and other initiatives like the European Union's medical device regulation, they're starting to move toward demonstration that your product is actually safe and effective, and that the systems and processes you have in place lead to that result of having a safe and effective product. Probably the biggest change, like if you're thinking like, well, what's different? What's changing? What do I have to be paying attention to? Is that the European Union's medical device regulation is now saying that combination products, see, I told you I'd get back to combination products. They're now saying that combination products have to comply with the medical device regulation. So they're not giving you a choice, either follow the pharmaceutical regulations or follow the medical device regulations. They're saying, no, you will follow the medical device regulations, which is pushing a lot of pharmaceutical companies to reevaluate their systems and their processes and procedures to say, oh, we didn't think we had to follow medical device stuff. Now we're going to have to follow medical device stuff. So companies like Management Control, which was, we had Larry Mager on, who is the founder of that company. Companies like his, and then there's another company called Greenlight Guru, who's going to be on a future episode within the next week or two. Companies like that are trying to help people understand, pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, what does this new medical device regulation mean? What does the FDA case for quality mean? And how do I make sure that my systems are focused on a quality product that is safe and effective, while at the same time demonstrating that I'm in compliance with the regulations. So that's where everybody's starting to focus now. If you are in the medical device industry, whether you just have you have one medical device and you're getting some funding and you want to take it to market, commercialization, if that's you, or you're at a major medical device manufacturing company and you make hundreds of different medical devices, both ends of that spectrum have to pay attention, because otherwise your company could be in another round of the FDA using its enforcement capacity, or the European Union using its enforcement capacity to get you to understand it. You really don't want to be there. So what you want to do is you want to do some research. Feel free to send me an email. I'm not the expert, by the way, but I know the experts. I have beers sometimes with the experts. I have them on the show. So shoot me an email at steven.vinson@bpm-associates.com, or check out the links in our show notes. Go to Google and search EU MDR, search FDA case for quality. Again, if you're so now I'm going to speak for a second just to these small like startups. Hey, I have this idea for an app on my phone or some other sort of medical device. What am I supposed to do? I don't have the money or the resources that these big corporations have. I'm here to tell you that's okay, because you can scale your quality system to match what you need. What I would implore you to do, though, is to get somebody who's been there and done that. Buy them a cup of coffee, buy them a beer, buy them a craft beer at a local brewery. Do something. Just have a chat with somebody. Tell them what it is you're trying to do, and let them tell you and recommend to you what you should do. Now, if you're afraid of, they're going to just try to sell me some big package system. If they do try to sell you that big package system, again, send me an email, because there are systems out there that don't cost a ton of money. They will right size it to your situation. Or at a minimum, develop something on your own, but please do something. You can't just ignore it. All right, enough of that. Thanks for tuning in again this week. I promise we'll have a guest next week. Not exactly sure who that's going to be, but I guarantee it'll be somebody in the medical device field, because that seems to be, these things come in waves, and our current wave seems to be medical device people. In the meantime, check out the episode with Larry Mager if you're a medical device person. That was a couple of weeks ago. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to have John Spear with Greenlight Guru. He has a great podcast, by the way, which if you're into the technical nuts and bolts of medical devices, you could check his out. It's called the Global Medical Device Podcast. And I'm trying to convince him to let me be on his show too. So if you love the sound of my voice as much as I do, then you'll be able to check that out at some point in the future. Regardless, subscribe, like, tell a friend, tell your boss, tell somebody. In the meantime, thanks for tuning in. Now go out there and make it happen. You have just experienced the Life Science Effect. If you liked it, be sure and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And more importantly, tell your colleagues, tell your boss, tell your friends. It'll make you look smart, and maybe it'll even get you a raise. Thanks again to our presenting sponsor, BPM Associates. Set your medical innovations in motion. BPM helps life science companies design, manage, and execute their most complex projects. What effect will you cause? Thanks to today's guest and to all of our guests. Who else should I be talking to? Send me an email at steven.vinson@bpm-associates.com. That's all for now. Thanks for listening, and go make something amazing happen.